The message was simple. One word. A word that was supposed to mean surrender. Instead, it became the moment a surrounded army decided it would rather disappear than move. Inside the frozen town of Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe looked at the German demands sitting in his hands. The enemy outside had tanks, thousands of soldiers, heavy artillery. The Americans inside had exhausted men, frozen weapons, empty stomachs, and almost no chance of being rescued. The question was not whether they were surrounded. They knew they were. The question was whether being surrounded meant they had already lost. McAuliffe had seconds to decide what kind of commander he would become. A commander who protected his remaining men by accepting reality, or a commander who asked them to endure something that should have been impossible. He chose. The reply sent back to the German lines contained one word. Nuts. The Germans did not understand. They asked what it meant. The American officer delivering the message explained. It meant they could go to hell, but the word itself was not the story. The story was the decision behind it. Because McAuliffe was not only answering a German officer, he was answering every exhausted soldier inside Bastogne who was wondering the same thing. When survival requires surrendering who you are, how long do you keep fighting? The answer would come from the men of the 101st Airborne Division. Men who had been trained for one purpose. Not to win when victory was likely, but to continue when victory no longer seemed possible. Months earlier, they were not legends. They were ordinary Americans. Farm workers, factory workers, students, mechanics. Men who had never imagined themselves standing in a frozen Belgian forest surrounded by elite German groups. They were taken to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, and placed into a new experiment in warfare. The army was not simply trying to create stronger soldiers. Strength was not enough. A strong man could still break. A skilled soldier could still retreat. The army wanted something harder to build. A person who could look at a collapsing situation and still believe there was one more decision available. The training removed comfort first, then confidence, then every excuse a man could use to explain why he could not continue. The men learned to march farther than they thought possible, to function while exhausted, to trust the person beside them when their own judgment began to fail. But the real transformation happened somewhere deeper. They worked on a new relationship with fear. Fear would exist. Pain would exist. The impossible would exist. But none of those things would make the decision for them. They would. That belief followed them into combat. And eventually, it followed them into the Ardennes. By December 1944, the war that many believed was nearing its end had changed direction. Germany launched one final offensive through the frozen forests of Belgium. The attack depended on surprise, speed, confusion, the idea that if the Allies were hit hard enough, they would break before they understood what was happening. For many American units, that is exactly what happened. The German advance pushed forward. Positions collapsed. Soldiers moved backward. Entire formations were caught in chaos. And far from the fighting, the 101st Airborne Division was supposed to be recovering. They had already endured months of combat. They had fought through brutal conditions. They were exhausted. They needed time. Instead, they received a new order. Move. The division was sent toward Bastogne. They did not know exactly what waited for them, but they could hear it. The sound of a battle already moving closer. As the trucks traveled through the night, they passed soldiers moving in the opposite direction. American troops retreating. Men who had seen the German attack. Men who knew what was coming. They shouted warnings. The Germans had armor. The Germans had numbers. The Germans were everywhere. They told the paratroopers that Bastogne was a place where men went to die. The soldiers of the 101st heard them, and kept driving. That was their first decision. Not a dramatic battlefield moment. Not a heroic last stand. Just a choice made inside a moving truck. They decided to continue toward the place everyone else was leaving, and that decision created the next problem. Because once they arrived, there was no easy way out. Bastogne was not a fortress. It was a town, a crossroads, a place the Germans needed to control to continue their offensive. The 101st was ordered to hold it, but holding it meant something different than anyone expected. It meant defending a wide perimeter with limited supplies. It meant fighting in temperatures that dropped far below freezing. It meant sleeping in frozen ground. It meant knowing that if wounded men could not be evacuated, the cold itself could become another enemy. The soldiers looked at the situation in front of them. They were surrounded. The enemy was stronger. The conditions were worse. The safe options were disappearing one by one. And then the German ring closed. Bastogne became an island. No road out. No immediate rescue. No guarantee anyone would survive. The Germans believed the next decision would be simple. They believed pressure would create surrender. That was how armies were supposed to work. Apply enough force. Remove enough hope. Eventually, people choose survival. But they had misunderstood the men inside Bastogne. Because the 101st had already made their most important decision. They had decided that being surrounded did not mean they were defeated. It only meant the enemy was now close enough to fight. The Germans still believed they were facing soldiers, but they were about to discover they were facing something different. A group of men who had already decided what they would do before the impossible arrived. And now the impossible had arrived. The first German demand was not an attack. It was an assumption. The Germans believed Bastogne was already finished. They believed the Americans inside were simply waiting for someone to tell them the war was over. The message sent under the white flag was designed to make surrender feel like the logical choice. The situation was clear. The Americans were surrounded. Their supplies were running low. The weather was becoming as dangerous as the enemy. Outside the perimeter, German armor waited. Inside, thousands of men had to decide whether endurance was still a military strategy, or only a slower way to lose. The German commander expected a conversation about terms. Instead, he received a word that revealed something much more dangerous. The Americans were not calculating their chances anymore. They had already chosen, and that choice forced the Germans to make theirs. They attacked. The first assaults were designed to prove the American position was impossible to hold. German infantry moved forward behind armor. They expected pressure to create collapse. They expected exhausted men to become practical. But every time a position was attacked, the same pattern appeared. The Americans gave ground only when they had to. Then they came back. The Germans were not fighting soldiers who believed they could win easily. They were fighting soldiers who had removed winning from the equation. Their decision was simpler. Hold. The German commanders had spent years studying warfare. They understood numbers, firepower, movement, supply. They knew what happened when an isolated force faced overwhelming pressure. The normal human response was predictable. Fear increased. Confidence disappeared. A person began searching for the moment when survival mattered more than resistance. But something about Bastogne broke that pattern. The Germans could understand courage. They could understand discipline. They could understand desperation. What they struggled to understand was commitment without a visible path to victory. Because the men inside Bastogne were no longer fighting for the situation to improve. They were fighting because they had decided they would be the ones who stayed. That decision moved from one man to another. Not through speeches. Not through orders. Through example. Sergeant Leighton Black saw that decision arrive at the most vulnerable place possible. A field hospital. The wounded were supposed to be protected. They were supposed to be removed from the fight. But the Germanists all reached the aid station. And suddenly the question was not whether Black could survive. The question was whether he would allow the wounded men behind him to be taken. He had limited weapons. No advantage. No guarantee of help. Only a choice. Leave. Or stay. He stayed. For 40 minutes. He held the entrance. When help finally arrived, German soldiers lay dead outside. Black was still there. Wounded himself. Still refusing to move. His decision did not change the entire battle. But that was never how Bastogne was won. It was not one impossible act. It was thousands of smaller decisions repeated until the enemy could no longer understand what they were facing. A soldier choosing not to abandon his position. A medic choosing not to abandon wounded men. A machine gunner choosing not to leave his weapon. Private First Class Vernon Haught faced that decision on Christmas Eve. A German tank moved toward his position. A Panzer. 40 tons of steel. A machine gun could not stop it. Everyone knew this. The tactical answer was obvious. Move. Survive. Find another position. But Haught looked at his gun. Then he looked at the men around him. And he made the decision that defined him. He stayed. The tank advanced. The machine gun fired. Not because it could destroy the armor. It could not. But because the infantry following behind the tank could still be stopped. Haught was not trying to perform a miracle. He was trying to buy seconds. Seconds for another soldier. Seconds for another weapon. Seconds for the people beside him. The tank fired. The blast threw him away from his position. For a moment, everything stopped. Then he stood up, found his weapon, and continued firing. Years later, when asked why he stayed, he did not describe courage. He did not describe sacrifice. He said something much simpler. That was my gun. Those were my guys. What else was I going to do? That answer explains Bastogne better than any battlefield map. Because the Germans were searching for a weakness. They were looking for the moment when a man would choose himself over the position. But the 101st had created a different kind of soldier. A soldier who no longer saw duty as something imposed from above. It had become part of who he was. The Germans had expected to break a defensive line. Instead, they discovered a collection of men who had already broken through their own limits. And this was the moment the enemy began changing. At first, the Germans were confident. They believed the Americans were out. Then they became frustrated, then confused. Then something far more dangerous happened. They began questioning their own assumptions. The problem was no longer simply taking Bastogne. The problem was understanding why their usual methods were failing. German officers began writing reports. Not about American weapons. Not about American numbers. About American psychology. They noticed something unusual. The paratroopers did not behave like men waiting for rescue. They behaved like men who had already accepted the possibility that rescue might never come. That made them unpredictable, because fear normally creates movement. It creates retreat. It creates hesitation. But the men inside Bastogne had already experienced their worst fear. They were surrounded, and they were still standing. The German commanders had removed every illusion of safety. But instead of creating surrender, they had created clarity. There was only one choice left. Stay. The battle became a contest between two beliefs. The Germans believed enough pressure would eventually force any human being to give way. The Americans believed pressure only revealed what a person had already decided. And now both sides were waiting to discover which belief was true. The answer would come during the coldest days of the siege, when ammunition was running low, when wounded men filled every available space, when the temperature itself became another enemy. The Germans were preparing one final attempt, not to test the Americans, to break them. Because if Bastogne fell, the German offensive could continue. If Bastogne survived, the entire attack would begin to lose momentum. Everything now depended on one question. How long could men continue after they had already reached the point where continuing made no sense? And inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was about to give the world its answer.